Hi everyone. Welcome back to the third monthly lecture for this ad hoc group, Food, Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. Today we have with us Dr. Richa Kumar, who is an associate professor at IIT Delhi, and she is going to talk about standardized foods and compromised consumers, tracing India's post-Green Revolution food history. So far, we have had two monthly talks since the inception of this very young research committee or ad hoc group. And we have had two lectures by Professor Kiranmai Bhushi and then Professor Krishnendu Ray. Both lectures are now uploaded on Indian Sociological Society's YouTube channel. In this third lecture, today we are going to delve into a different kind of topic where she's going to talk about the transformation of Indian agriculture by the state during the Green Revolution of the 1960s and how the industrial logic that harness science and technology transforms agriculture and has had significant impacts on people's diets and led to greater nutritional insecurity. I'm going to very briefly introduce our speaker. Richa Kumar is an associate professor of sociology and science and technology studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her current research is on the impact of monoculture farming on farm systems, the environment, and human health. She is the author of Rethinking Revolutions, Soyabean, Chopals, and the Changing Countryside in Central India, published by OUP in 2016 and co-author of the State of Rural and Agrarian India Report 2020. Her work has been featured on the TEDx platform and through two documentaries by Scoop Hoop Documentaries and Vice News. Maybe you can check them out after the talk is over. She is a core group member of the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies, and she has completed her PhD in the Science, Technology and Society program at the MIT Cambridge, USA. Richa, I welcome you to this session, and perhaps you could talk about your topic for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we have a very young audience which can engage with the key in a Q&A with you. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, great, Rituparna. Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. And I'm really actually excited about this RC that you have managed to create with so much time and effort and a lot of you together. This within the Indian Sociological Society to get people to think about food. It's just fantastic because for many years, a lot of work in sociology had shifted to many other issues, a lot of it was around cultural aspects of, say, religion or violence and many other questions. And the agrarian had really disappeared. And, before I sort of begin my talk, it's sort of nice to sort of think back almost 20 years ago when I had started looking at some of these questions. The agrarian was really nowhere, and certainly food was nowhere on the horizon in terms of research on it. Economists and sociologists had spent a lot of time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then liberalization in the 90s took a wholly different turn. So it's wonderful to see so many people back once again, looking at agriculture, looking at food, health, all these relationships. So I'm very excited to be here. So thank you, Rituparna, for organizing this and for inviting me. So I'll begin briefly. The talk today I'm giving is actually based on a paper that has been published in the Sociological Bulletin, and perhaps some of you may have seen it earlier. And I will briefly summarize it, and then I'm happy to take questions in the middle. If you want clarifications, we can have more conversations at the end. But please feel free to, chime in with questions either on the chat or if you want to interrupt and ask a clarification, I'm happy to stop in the middle. So let me begin. I'm now trying to change my slides and let me see if this works. Okay, there we go. So I begin by actually referring to the larger research project that led me to my work on food and nutrition. I was really looking at, agrarian issues in the past, broadly in critical agrarian studies. And with that, one of the larger questions that emerged in front of me was a real disconnect between the agricultural places that I saw. I mean, my work was primarily in Madhya Pradesh, but I had spent time looking at fields and farms in Haryana as well as Tamil Nadu and some other places. And on the one hand, you saw rising quote unquote prosperity in agriculture. On the other hand, there was this continued physical, very visceral experience of malnutrition. And I couldn't quite reconcile the two. How is it that, supposedly rural areas are better off? And then you've had this whole green revolution, and my earlier work was on the yellow revolution, and things were supposed to have become better, but there are all kinds of strange stories and histories that I was learning around food and around malnutrition. And so that prompted me to try and understand, well, what is it that the Green Revolution did for us? And did it provide us with a lot of food? What is the sort of contradiction between having a lot more resources, a lot more food, supposedly, and still so much malnourishment? And I began this project with a whole host of other people, economists as well as various grassroots organizations and activists who are trying to look at very similar questions around food and malnutrition. And interestingly, the economic data bore out the same thing, that we seemed not to be dealing with our malnutrition story any better. And emerging out of this research, so in the first part of my talk, I'm going to give you a brief idea about the research and then take it into larger questions of what really did the Green Revolution provide us with, and then what are the implications of that really for our food, diets, and nutrition today. So, what emerged in our research and what you see here, and this is, of course, available on this particular website, it's bilingual, Hindi and English, because we were also trying to reach out to our own, the people that we did our research with, which is in Western Awadh in Uttar Pradesh. So, we try to curate the site with our findings. And what you see here is a food mat. And you see a whole diversity of foods on the food mat, and this emerged from our research. So when we asked people, what is it that you ate in the past? Well, all of this stuff came out of this. This is through focus group discussions, long interviews, and you can look up on the website details about our research methodology. And what you see in this particular table is in the second column tells you historically the number of varieties of this particular category that people ate. I mean, look at 24 fruits, 18 types of animal and bird meats, 29 different types of vegetables, leafy vegetables, edible flowers. And then what has happened in terms of the drastic reduction in many of these and they're being available. This, interestingly, then coincides quite unfortunately neatly with reduction in cropping diversity. So again, 40, 50 years back, people grew so many different varieties of millets in particular. So you can see bajra, sawa, kodo, kakun, madua, and of course, so many different varieties of pulses, different types of oil seeds. And now you can see in the 2010s how that has shrunk drastically. And the millets, of course, have disappeared. Most of the dals have also disappeared. And this is sort of ironic because the region that we were working in to do this research in Western Awadh has been famous for its dals. In fact, it was known as the home of dals. Ki Sitapur was the specific place where we were in. Sitapur ki dalein mashhoor hua karti thi. And these dals used to go all the way to Gujarat, all the way to Bengal. Pretty much the entire North Indian region is where these dals used to be sent off across from Sitapur. And today, pretty much it's all very, very much reduced in both scale and scope. And what that also meant is that people used to have urad ki dal, for example, with urad ki roti. There was so much dal around. And as you all, of course, are aware, the dals are such an important source of protein. So what we saw in this region was a drastic reduction in availability of protein-rich foods. And that is in fact visible. So the earlier information that I showed you was from focus group discussions talking about historical diets of people through interviews and focus group discussions. But this, we did a 4-round 24-hour diet recall consumption survey with my economist colleagues from IIT Delhi. And what you can see is a shift in where the carbohydrates are coming from. So it's wheat and rice instead of all, and bajra and barley were the two other staples. People hardly ate much wheat, hardly any rice. But now it's the other way around. Bajra and barley have disappeared, or jaw has disappeared. Wheat and rice are predominant. And you have, of course, this new addition of biscuits or rusk and potatoes. And these four are the staple carbohydrates of people. And then along with this, what you see is a drastic reduction in protein consumption. So going from the historical days when people, would eat so much animal food, so much dairy, and there are interesting stories around food and dairy that, I can get into in the Q&A, um, uh, especially in terms of its relationship with caste. But what you see as of the surveys we did in 2017 is that only 50% of the households were consuming any protein source during our survey. And so this is, consumed on all 3 days of our survey. The methodology of the 24-hour diet recall is that you have to go 3 days, sort of, you leave a day in between, and then that constitutes one round. And we did 4 such rounds. So we have 12 points of 12 data points for each household's 24-hour consumption. And it's interesting that if you see an anomaly in here in December 2017, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but this is 79% here. And that is, again, there's very interesting, sociologists will really like this explanation, because we did the survey, we found this information, and we were like, how come, it's so different from all the other 3 rounds? And it turned out that on one of the 3 days of our survey, we had this festival where the ritual offering made during that festival is actually a urad ka bada. And so urad ki dal was in fact either bought, purchased, or borrowed from people in the village by many, many households to make that urad ka bada. And that is what transformed our consumption data, because of that one festival which fell on that particular day. So broadly, the point I'm trying to make here is that there has been a serious reduction in protein consumption because of the varieties of protein items that are no longer available. And again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A about why possibly that may have happened, and a rise in carbohydrate consumption of a certain kind. And this takes me now from my work in Sitapur to really a very, very large scale, I mean, all India level in terms of data sets, to try and understand what is going on. So perhaps you all may be familiar with what is known as the double burden of malnutrition, which is that countries so the broader theory around the nutrition transition is that as countries increase along the so-called scale of development, so as incomes of people go up, people's the consumption of food diversity in their diets is supposed to go up. At least that's what the theory of nutrition transition suggests. Undernourishment must come down. I mean, that's again the idea. But what is being seen in the data globally is that there is a rise in overweight and obesity. And this shows, this is data from the National Family Health Survey 2005-6, 2015-16, 2019-21. And there is a clear trend that you can see that the percentage of undernourished people in the last 20 years has fallen from about 30% to approximately 18% or so. But the proportion of a population that is overweight or obese has gone up from about 13% or so to now nearly 24-25%. So 1 in 4 Indians, and this is of course now 4 years old. The latest sort of numbers that are perhaps emerging are somewhere between 25 and 30% of overweight and obese people in our country. This is adult population. So there is something to be concerned about here. The original idea was that as we are able to so-called, go up the ladder of progress, incomes improve, things should really become better. But while it seems that undernourished people are coming down, why is it that overweight and obesity is increasing at such a rate? Why do we have something known as a double burden of malnutrition? And in fact, more recently, this has turned into the triple burden of malnutrition, which is referring the third aspect to this is micronutrient deficiencies. And what you see in NFHS 5, which is 2019-20 data, is that anemia. So women and children who are anemic, those numbers have actually gone up in the last 20 years. So more than 50% of our women and children are anemic. Stunting certainly hasn't reduced. So there are other kinds of aspects of malnutrition that are continuing and possibly even becoming worse. So there is certainly a mismatch. So the point here that I want to emphasize is that what I saw in the field, with rising incomes and prosperity, big pakka houses and, tube wells and lots of production and increasing productivity and malnourished bodies at the same time, it's showing up in these very large scale statistics too. And this is a puzzle that needs to be explained. And, part of my work has been trying to figure out how do we explain this contradiction? How do we explain this puzzle? And I want to bring in one more statistic here, which is sort of quite interesting to put India in perspective. This is a statistic from the Center for Disease Control, CDC, in the United States. And this is again now almost 10-year-old data. But in 2015 and 16, 70% of American adults were overweight or obese. In India, of course, it's 25%. We are inching slowly and slowly and quite clearly going up in the trend. And if you look, unsurprisingly now, after all this work, the work that I've been able to do in this project, unsurprisingly, the rates of people being overweight and obese has gone up around the world. So this is not something peculiar either to India or to the United States, but you look at countries across South Asia, you look at countries around Asia, countries in Latin America, you find similar kinds of trends of the double burden of malnutrition as well as rising obesity. So I'm going to now briefly try and explain part of this through the Green Revolution transition that took place. And then the second part of the explanation has to do with a certain kind of technology-led transformation of our food that has contributed further to this particular problem. So perhaps maybe I should show this particular graph, and then if people are interested, I can go back to the table, but this graph sort of sums it up. But if one looks at the transformation of food availability in our country after the Green Revolution, so the idea is originally the idea was that, we are hungry, we are starving, we are not producing enough food. And so we needed the Green Revolution to ensure that everybody got enough to eat. But if you look at actually the statistics around food, then it turns out that, of course, perhaps, in here it's clear that we have doubled or more than doubled the amount of wheat available. We have halved the amount of pulses, grams, and millet. And if you go back here, you will see we have retained rice at about the same level. And these are the exact numbers. This, of course, is taking into account population, which means that we have increased the production of wheat so much so that even though the population has gone up, we have a lot more wheat available. But for the other two categories of pulses, millets, and gram, of course, population has gone up, but otherwise areas have declined. So area under millet and gram cultivation drastically came down. And of course, production also declined along with that. And with people, the explanation for all of this is that people shifted land away from growing pulses, millets, gram, and oil seeds to growing more wheat and rice. And you saw that earlier when we spoke about the reduction in cropping diversity, that people shifted primarily in the particular region in Western Awadh that we were doing our work. People shifted from growing a whole variety of different things to wheat, rice, and sugarcane. Those are the three main crops of that region now. And that has had a direct impact on the availability of these foods in our country. So while after the Green Revolution, we stopped importing wheat, which we were doing under PL 480. And again, in the Q&A, I can get more into the logics of the Green Revolution. Why did it happen when we were importing PL 480 wheat? Why were we importing it? But we stopped importing wheat after the Green Revolution really set pace. In 1975 was the last year that we imported PL 480 wheat. But pretty much in the 1970s, we started importing oilseeds and pulses. So it's sort of ironical that, we are told that we became self-sufficient in food, quote unquote food, after the Green Revolution, but effectively we became self-sufficient in wheat. Or more than sufficient in wheat and somewhat self-sufficient certainly in rice. But we became net importers of pulses and oilseeds. And today we import more than 70% of our oilseeds. In the last few years, we have reduced the imports of our pulses significantly, although we were importing more than 50% of our pulses at one point of time. And so essentially what we have done is simply transform the nature of our imports. From rice and wheat, from wheat, we shifted to pulses and oilseed imports. But at the same time, we added two more types of imports into the story, which is imports of raw materials for making fertilizers and imports of petroleum for running our tractors and all the machinery on the farm. So effectively, agriculture became a net importing sector overall rather than an exporting sector as is supposedly, or a self-sufficient sector as it is supposed to be. But of course, that story aside, that's more of an economic story, an agrarian story. What does this ultimately have to do with our diets and with our food? And here, what is sort of most interesting is that when the Green Revolution came in, and there's a whole package of practices that came along with that, technologies of seeds, but the seeds also needed fertilizers, they needed water, tube wells and pumps, pesticides, all the rest of it. With that package, the most important part of that package was that government was buying the wheat and rice that farmers grew to supply through the public distribution system. And that was the link to food security, that we will supply this to the masses to reduce malnutrition, to reduce hunger. Now, that process ultimately became a process that was linked to the industrialization of agriculture in the country. And this process of industrialization was essentially linked to a certain imitation of the process as it had taken place in different parts of the Western world. And I'll focus predominantly on the United States because that is where uh, the bulk of these technologies were developed and many of these ideas were exported to our country. And policymakers and bureaucrats in our own country believed very much in the power of technology, in the power of efficiency in particular. And in this paper, I talk about four different tropes. I talk about modernization, I talk about food security, I talk about efficiency, and I talk about quality as four important pillars on which this industrialization of agriculture stood. And these were the four pillars that were used to justify the industrialization of agriculture. And in the process, we transformed the way we processed our rice, wheat, sugar, and oils, which were the four fundamental raw materials that we would use to produce the foods that we eat today. So I'm going to run us very briefly and fairly quickly through the technologies that transformed our food. And then I will come back to the ideas of industrial agriculture and the four pillars that were used to justify these transformations. So what you see here is on the right, of course, a grain of wheat, and the left is a little table describing how the wheat has been transformed. And I'll give you a brief background. So possibly, maybe many of you, if you speak to your grandparents' generation, maybe your parents' generation will, in their generation, people stored a lot of grain at home, whether it was millets or wheat. And then whenever you needed to use it, you would grind it into flour. And that grinding either took place at home or it took place within the community, in the ward, in the area, where you had someone known as a chakkiwala who would do this for you. And that chakkiwala would use a stone chakki, typically two stones, and then either it was manual. Eventually, when electricity came through, then you had these electric chakkis that would also run a lot. This stuff in many villages, at least till about 10-15 years ago, these still existed. On the IIT Delhi campus where I teach, we had one again till about COVID, and our COVID created somewhat sort of issues with it. But the stone chakki has been an important part of the presence of processing of our food, especially of the flour that we eat. But in the last 40 years, and especially after especially after liberalization, but also in terms of the push that has taken place in the PDS and through various other government institutions for providing packaged flour, there has been a shift to what is known as a roll of flour mill. And the roller flammel technology produces various kinds of byproducts. So in the stone chakki, you tell the person what you want, and you will either get suji, or you can get atta, or you can get dalia, for instance. So it will be ground to that consistency. So you can get only one product. But in the roller flammel, when you run your wheat, you can get all of these products at the same time. But what is most important is the last row on the bottom, which is choker. So when you grind things in a stone chakki, 8% of the output is choker, and choker is actually thrown away. It is not consumed by us, but it's given to animals. In the roller flammel, as you can see, 20% of the output is choker, or is thrown aside as choker. And if you see the picture on the right, then you can see that there are 5 layers of bran. The maida on top, 52%, is the endosperm. And the choker is what consists of the bran, pretty much. What we are doing is the most important nutrient part of the bran is what is being given to animals. And even the atta and of course, the maida we know for sure is devoid of nutrients. It's only the gluten that is available. And the other products also from a roller flammel don't have much of the bran in them. And, this came to fore really, it hit me and my co-researchers very starkly when we went and we saw this state-of-the-art roller flammel in Sitapur, in fact. And at the end of the entire 2 hours of, going through this spick and span, beautiful roller flammel, and very, very high tech, because we came to know that the machinery had in fact come from Switzerland, of all the places. We were having tea with the manager, and then my colleague asked him that, you must be eating the atta from here. This is such a fantastic mill that you have. And he really recoiled in horror and sort of said that, no, 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 we don't eat the atta from here. And we were quite flabbergasted that, such a wonderful mill, why don't you eat the atta from here? And he said, oh, this atta has no nutrition in it. I get atta from the Sitapur stone chakki, from the Sita chakki. So it's sort of really interesting how, on the one hand, technology has been privileged. So the when he was taking us around the roller flour mill, he was telling us how hygienic it is. It's not touched by hand. How clean it is. How modern it is. So the whole idea about the machines from Switzerland. So this notion of modernity plays a very important role. The notion of hygiene plays a very important role in shaping our understanding as consumers of what is it to have something that is, and of course, maida is refined wheat flour. So the logic of what is refined, so it's supposed to be better for you. And that's exactly the logic that is entirely negating the nutrition that is available in the wheat. And if you see, the story is similar with rice. This is, of course, a whole diversity of rice varieties that we have. And you can see highly polished white rice also in a couple of these pictures. The same rice, you can have it in an unpolished state or you can have it polished. And there is another interesting story around here, that the government, for rice in particular, rice is provided as milled rice in the PDS. And the sort of debate, or not really the debate, but really the sort of tug of war that is being played here is between shelf life and nutrition. So the government of India recently, just in the last few years, came up with this order that all rice mills in the country had to install what is known as a silky sortex machine. And the name, of course, tells you silky sortex, that's supposed to polish the rice so much that it's almost like silk. And the logic of the silky sortex machine, according to the Joint Secretary of the Consumer Affairs Department, is that, well, we needed to do that to ensure that the shelf life of the rice is longer. But when you do that and you create the silky sortex rice, it's fine as silk, but it's as useless as silk to eat. It is completely devoid of all the nutrition in it. But for the last 30-40 years, the rice and wheat that people have been eating and the rice and atta that people have been eating, not only through the PDS, but also through all other outlets, has been highly polished, has been devoid of the bran. And if you see, jitni safed roti, the whiter the roti, it's supposed to be better, but the whiter the roti, the less bran it has in it. So somewhere there is a logic between whiteness, whether it's, highly polished rice, there are certain aspirational, issues around this about why is it that something whiter is associated with better social status, a better form of consumption, which we can, again discuss during the Q&A. And, this comes to fore quite interestingly also in the case of sugar. And so sugarcane has been the other crop that has been propagated by the government in particular. And, ironically, in the 50s and 60s, the government itself penalized good manufacturers or jaggery manufacturers and supported sugar manufacturers, again in the name of modernization and the name of hygiene. So you can see, of course, there's a picture of sugarcane on the top, but in the below that is a picture of this Dalmia sugar factory that we had visited during my field work. And you can see, everything comes in bags and then it's sort of sealed by the machines and nothing is touched by hand. Again, this whole thing about, hygiene plays a very, very important role in creating a certain logic of quality in our minds, which is sort of the fourth pillar around the sort of industrialization logic that I spoke about. And, we'll again get back to it. But if you look at, again, the nutritive content, so white sugar, of course, there's no nutritive value in it. Good has a whole host of other vitamins and minerals in it, and especially a bunch of iron, which is quite important. And, finally, the darker the good, the more nutritive value, the more iron it has in it. But because white sugar was being propagated by the government, and this logic of whiteness as being better was sort of an important aspect of the way people in society were looking at foods in general. Good manufacturers began to whiten their good. So then they would, add chemicals, various kinds of chemicals into the good to bleach it, to whiten it, and say that, oh, the whiter the good. So it's really ironic. My grandmother, when she bought good, she knew that the darker the good, in her mind, quality meant good quality good was darker good. When my mother was buying good, when she was still, good was still broadly available, this is a long while ago, in her mind, good quality good was whiter good. And of course, when I was growing up, good was nowhere on our plates at all. We only had sugar. We only had white sugar. Of course, good is now making a comeback. Many of these things are actually making a comeback. But it's interesting to see how they were structurally transforming, many structural factors, including specific policies, including specific technologies, were transforming our diet so significantly. Because, of course, good is manufactured locally in these good bales. Again, if you see the process, one can say, well, how hygienic may or may it not be. The factory, of course, is far more modern and, provides you with a much more hygienic product. The last set of foods I want to focus on before we get into the broader logics of industrial agriculture is edible oils. And this is refined edible oils in particular. Again, you can see the term refined here, where historically, what we have consumed in our country and around the world is oils that taste very different from each other, smell very, very different from each other, look very different from each other. Anybody from Bengal cannot hope to cook, their fish, in anything but mustard oil. And sesame oil, groundnut oil have been the staple of diets in the north, in the west, coconut oil, of course, in the south. But what you saw post-liberalization in particular, although this has a prehistory with the state promoting dalda or vanaspati before liberalization. So the important point later on, I'll briefly say it here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the transformation of our diets is not only because of liberalization or due to a certain corporatization of foods that has certainly happened. But a lot of it can be traced to the logics of the state, whether it's rice, wheat, sugar, or even edible oils, where when you got the technology to strip oils of their color, their flavor, their smells, so you deodorized them, you decolored them, you created an oil which was from nowhere. So every oil has some kind of geographic, agroecological roots where it's coming from, where it's suitable for those specific areas in terms of people's health and diets. It's part of cultures and cuisines. It's part of recipes and foods. But when you created an oil from nowhere, it could fit everywhere. And this oil from nowhere became branded first as Vanaspati. So it first came to our into our diets as dalda in particular, and a lot of dalda was created out of palm oil and soybean oil, especially in the 1980s. Remember, I told you that we started importing oils, right? We were not growing enough of it in our country. And so we were importing palm oil and soybean oil and converting it into vanaspati and then selling that in the market. That was a cheap replacement for ghee. And then eventually when, as and when the issues around vanaspati emerged that, oh, maybe it is not so good for us, we shifted to this notion of refined edible oils. But now increasingly we are being told that these refined edible oils, which are created through the same process of deodorizing, decoloring these oils, through heat and through other kinds of chemical formulations, is in fact stripping the oils of their nutritive value. And so we are now saddled with the basic raw materials in our diet, rice, wheat, sugar, and refined edible oil, as being fairly compromised in what they are providing to us in terms of nutrition. And if you see here, this actually doesn't give you, of course, the whole diversity of foods. There are many, many more. But whether it's Indian foods, from your naan, rumali roti, puri or luchi, samosa, even gulab jamun, jalebi, khaja, lots of things, to the Western stuff that now we have adopted into our diet. So that's pasta, noodles, bread, biscuits, buns, Maggie, all of it, the raw material ingredients. So some of these are, of course, coming from a processed factory. So your pizza bases or the noodles or the pasta or the burger buns, they're coming from a factory. But we are possibly making the puris at home on our own. We may be making many of these, the sweets possibly on our own, or in our mithai shops, they are being made. So again, this is not necessarily a processed factory kind of or a corporate kind of logic that is necessarily emerging, but our own traditional foods have been transformed in terms of the raw material used to make them. So in the past, when these foods were actually made using atta, because maida is a product of the industrial food system. Without the roller flour mill, there cannot be any maida or refined wheat flour. And without the industrial process system, you can't have white sugar, you can't have refined oil. All of these three are products of an industrial processing system. And earlier, most of the sweets were made using gur. In fact, Professor Ishita Dey's interesting work has been on this historically. And we would use traditional cold-pressed oils or ghee or various other, ways to, and not refined oil to make any of these products. And so the story around the transformation of our diets is somewhat more complicated than the simplistic sort of westernization of diets or liberalization has done a lot of damage to us. Certainly it has. But the roots of it go further back to the Green Revolution, to these technologies of processing that were in fact brought in by the state, in the name, of course, of food security, in the name of modernization, in the name of efficiency. So that's another important aspect of this whole thing. And of course, quality and hygiene that I spoke about. And so this sort of brings me, and Rituparna, I'm not sure what is my time like. Maybe this is a good...
I think if you can finish in 10 minutes or so, is that okay?
That's perfect. Maybe possibly even less. So this sort of brings me then to the larger logic that I've been talking about, or that I want to talk about in this particular paper. And if you see so of course, I wish I could sort of have this more interactive. I don't know if people, I'm sure people have sort of guessed what these two plates are. The one on the right is, of course, hybrid tomatoes that have come from the market. The one on the left, I have a little bit of a patch of, garden in my house at IIT. And so these are tomatoes from my garden in IIT. Desi tomatoes, as they say. And, as consumers, and this is true even of myself, before I started doing all this research, and, after doing all this research, I've had to completely change the way I think about my own food. And it's of course been quite difficult. And that's sort of the struggle that I want to get at through this picture here, is that when we go to buy food, we look at the tomatoes on the right, mostly uniform in size and shape, uniform in color, shining, red. That's what we want to buy. This is what we also see on the now. So much of the buying is now in the online world, right? In the digital world. And so we see these beautiful pictures, and then we want the stuff that shows up at our doorstep to look exactly like that. But if you speak to farmers, and that's sort of the interesting thing, they say that foods, especially vegetable and fruits that perhaps have been eaten by an insect, in fact, will probably be the sweetest or the most nutritious fruit on the tree or on the plant. Because insects have a certain logic of getting attracted to the ones that have the best nutritive value, or at least the sweetest in terms of their characteristics. But we would never hope to buy anything that may be insect ridden. You can see the green tomato on the top that has a little bit that has been eaten by an insect, and of course the whole discoloration, if one wants to use that particular word. So there is a certain definition of quality that we as consumers have developed in our own minds, that has come from a certain place. Where has it really come from? And sort of this is my last slide actually. What you see on the left is the potato variety that was originally patented by PepsiCo, and then PepsiCo of course lost the patent fight with the Indian farmers, and so now anybody and everybody can sort of grow this. But this is a variety that is used for making Lay's chips. And of course, PepsiCo, given the huge amount, and this is where your corporatization does come into the story, where the explosion of foods like chips, like cola, like noodles, or the Maggi variant, all of these are coming from, they are processed industrial foods that depend on the creation. I mean, that depend on the creation of a monoculture raw material product. So what you see on the left is this particular potato variety that uh, it is only this particular potato variety that PepsiCo wants to buy to make the Lay's potato chips. Any other potato variety, either it's the starch content is too much, or it's too long, or it's too unshapely, or some other problem with it. But this variety they've figured is the most easiest to process in an industrial food processing system, to produce the same quality of Lay's chips at the other end. The story in a country like the United States is a story of McDonald's. McDonald's has a particular potato variety, the Russet Burbank, that it has been encouraging farmers to grow in the United States in particular, because it's a long potato and you can get the French fries to a uniform length. So can you see the logic that is being displayed here? That on the one hand, you are creating a standardized raw material, so a standardized crop that needs to be grown by a farmer on a monoculture farm. And as we all know, that to grow a monoculture product on a farm requires you to kill everything else. Everything else becomes a weed or a pest. You have to use weedicides and pesticides and fertilizers and water and a whole host of things. I mean, it's sort of like, the pet dog versus the stray dog. The pet dog has to really be pampered to, do stuff. Whereas the desi varieties, you can leave them alone and they'll still sort of survive and they'll manage. But you need to take care of this monoculture potato to produce it. And of course, there is a huge amount of risk in this process, because nature doesn't actually believe in standardization. But the farmer is being forced to produce a standardized product because it is supposed to go into this industrial supply chain. But the logic of that industrial supply chain is actually coming from the consumer. So how is it coming from the consumer? Because, PepsiCo is saying, well, we need to create the perfect size, the perfect taste, the perfect crunch, the perfect look, taste, feel of a potato chip. which will sell more potato chips for them. And, millions of rupees are spent in all of these tasting sort of research that they do to figure out what exactly will sell the best. And it is the consumer who is made as the rationale or the logic for making the farmer grow a standardized food product. But if you look at it now from the consumer's point of view, what we have created by creating an industrial food process system is an immunocompromised consumer. And this consumer is not only the consumer that I began with in Sitapur, in those villages in Sitapur. Of course, those people are both farmers, but they're also consumers. And their foods have now, the diversity has disappeared from their plates in terms of all the whole list of things that you saw on the first slide. But from our plates also the diversity has gone, because all of the different potatoes that you see on the right, many of them now, especially if you're, depending on which particular part of an urban city you may be in, not all of these varieties may be available. Online, some of them may be, but again, depending on how market dynamics work, certain varieties may be made more available. And if more consumers and more PepsiCos are demanding a certain variety of potato, then farmers will be forced to grow more of that. So what you see is, by moving to an industrial system of food processing and making those certain kinds of foods available, we are not only standardizing foods on the farm that are grown, but we are also standardizing foods that are coming to our plates. And by standardizing the foods that are coming to our plates, or, the causality can work both ways in here. And again, we can talk more about that. We are creating a consumer who is eating highly polished carbohydrates and very little of anything else. So if you look at our diets, and our urban diets today, our children, what is it that they're eating? They're eating all of these noodles and momos and pizzas and buns and burgers and cola and chips and the rest of it. Again, all of it coming from refined wheat flour, refined edible oil, and white sugar, if you look at the underlying base material of all of this. So there is a serious contradiction that we have, where on the one hand, we are supposedly better off, both in terms of productivity and more so in terms of modernization, efficiency, so-called quality, so-called food security. But on the other hand, we have got diets that are so nutritionally compromised. And we saw this during COVID, the entire comorbidity issue that we had with blood pressure, high blood pressure, and diabetes being important comorbid variables in terms of impacting people who would not survive due to COVID. A lot of that is, of course, linked to obesity, underlying obesity in the country. And as we are seeing a huge rise in overweight and obesity, of course, there are multiple factors, including our lifestyles, that are shaping that. But eating very highly processed foods, and particularly highly polished carbohydrates, and very little protein in our diets, is a known factor that shapes these kinds of outcomes. And there is so much research on this in the public health space. But the public health literature, the agricultural literature, and the food systems literature, those people have not been talking to each other. Now people are finally beginning to do that. We are hoping through our work, we can get these different constituent groups to talk to each other, to understand what's really going on, and to begin to transform our food system once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Richa, for that very wonderful and invoking talk. I now open the floor for questions and comments. We already have one question. I'll just read it out to you. So, how do you view the recent shift in agrarian practices in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, where the government is encouraging farmers to cultivate palm oil through subsidies and training, a non-food crop? Earlier, farmers primarily engaged in shifting cultivation and focused on food crops like wet rice and vegetables. What are your thoughts on this change in agricultural policy and its impact on the region? After that, I see a raised hand. So once Dr. Kumar answers this question, we can move to the next one.
So excellent question. Thank you for asking the question. And it is a disaster, to say the least, because again, on multiple fronts. On the one hand, why is it that we are having an oilseed crisis? So the justification for the palm oil push is that, oh, India doesn't have enough oil seeds, doesn't have enough oil. We are importing all this palm oil, soybean oil from abroad. Well, why don't we grow our own palm oil? I mean, why don't we grow our own coconut oil and sesame oil and groundnut oil and mustard oil? All of that. Why don't we incentivize our farmers to grow the oils that are traditionally part of our food system? But we are not doing that. All of those farmers are in fact being incentivized to grow rice, wheat, and sugarcane. It's crazy the lopsided way our policy incentives are working for farmers. And instead, in a region that has such a huge diversity and biodiversity, not only of foods, but also of so many other crops and plants around, we are converting it into palm oil monocultures. Palm oil is interesting. People keep demonizing palm oil and saying, oh, it's a terrible food to eat. Well, refined palm oil, yes, it's terrible to eat. But if you go to West Africa and if you go to Northeast Brazil, well, that was the home of West Africa, is the original home of palm oil, where the palm oil fruit is red in color. The oil that comes out of it is also red in color. And that very, very flavorful, red colored, very strong, pungent oil is an important part of West African and Northeastern Brazilian cuisine. Of course, why Northeastern Brazil? Because all of these West Africans were taken to Northeastern Brazil on the slave ships, 200-300 years ago. But it's part of the local cuisine, just like the Bengali fish made in mustard oil is part of our cuisine in India. And so, of course, palm oil in that context makes perfect sense. But why to bring it to India, and why to, I mean, we cannot even hope to consume it without stripping it of its color, of its odor, of the chemicals, and, all of the rest of it. It'll be impossible for us to eat it. So we are pushing standardization on the farm again in this process. We are pushing a standardized, unhealthy food into our diets. It's unbelievable why we are doing this.
Right. So, Sabari has a raised hand. If you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
Hi. I would just like to know, so of course the impact of green revolution is huge on our like the food that we consume and the how it changed the food profile. But the thing is could you please elaborate like things other than green revolution or that preceded green revolution that might have led to this? I'm asking this in this context like where I am also looking at like that's a dominant narrative where green revolution came and it changed the food profile. But I'm afraid like there is also something more to it, like the sense for example, rice. It has been regarded as like something culturally, historically, it has been regarded as something above millets. And also like the tubers, I'm looking at the 60s and 70s, and then like it seems like it preceded a little. Even before like electric pumps, they were like oil pumps, oil driven pumps. So whenever people got a chance to cultivate rice, they chose rice. So even in dry regions, they like used to grow rice at least for one season. If not, like now it's happening in like 3 seasons, all over the year they grow rice. So like maybe like in the context of wheat or like even in terms of rice, like so why do people prefer rice and wheat? Green revolution is definitely, it played a huge part, no denying that at all. But what's the logic behind this? Is it maybe it's because of the PDS, like maybe in 60s, or I don't know, but but what are the other factors? That's one question. Like the other another question is like
can I answer this and then you
sure.
can ask the other one?
Sure.
But excellent question. And you're absolutely right that, it is not just the Green Revolution alone. What the Green Revolution did, actually, the one, I hate to say this, but quote unquote, good thing that the Green Revolution did was democratize access to rice and wheat. And so rice and wheat have been known as the privileged, foods of the privileged. So wheat, of course, in the north was, food for guests. Rice, of course, white rice in particular, there are so many interesting stories and, poems around the sort of evocative white rice grain that, somebody wants to have. And all that is there in their jholi or, in their fate is this millet that they don't really want to have. And there is that history is something that, it intersects also with colonial history. So, if you look at the names of many of our foods, the English names, the names are animal names. So whether it's, horse gram or cowpea or, many of these things, millets were also, they were not called millets. No, they were known as the coarse cereals. And of course, you had the fine cereals. Now, that's totally illogical if you look at the grains physically. There is nothing coarse about any of the millets. In fact, wheat and rice are coarser if you just feel them and touch them. The millets are all smooth and shiny. But there was a certain, so this the linguistic transformation of these grains under colonial rule certainly added to this particular logic. But this caste class based logic that historically has been a very important part of our food cultures is also something to try and investigate. That's something we haven't been able to do much with in our own particular project, but it's certainly a research question that I would encourage anybody here to take on, to try and see how do we trace some of these issues back. I mean, it's the same thing in sugar and good, right? There's this logic of whiteness. I mean, it's skin, logic of whiteness. I mean, what do all these have in common, if anything? Or what else may be possibly going on? So excellent question, and I'll request you to ask the second one.
Yeah. So actually, I'm working with a group of farmers who are actually into production of native rice varieties and native seeds, and then they create collectives and also. So what I realize is that like it's we can talk about this, but the thing is like it's very, we don't have the social setup necessary to like produce the rice varieties or like the native varieties that we used to at some point. Like, so when it comes to rice, like the hand milling, I don't think it's like possible now. It also had a gendered labor that so also like now even the farmers, like the farmers whom I'm working with, they also process themselves the rice, and then they look for rice mills that have this rubber shellers instead of hullers, so that the bran is not removed. So so like there is this, so how do you bring this like, so what are we prescribing, in the sense like we can't, the distance from prescribing also, it's not, we can't just like say that like I'm just like saying these things and like I'm like staying away from all this. So so it's like it doesn't seem to be possible to produce those kind of rice varieties anymore. So like, or like any like crop variety anymore. So like so what is your take on this? Yeah.
Excellent question again. You're absolutely right. And, I'll answer this question actually for millets, because that's been more of a thing now. Last year, 2023 was the International Year of Millets, and there's been so much push that, we should all, begin eating millets. The problem with millets is the same thing. If you process them through an industrial processing system, you get rid of all the bran. And what is left is entirely nutritionally deficient. But hand processing of millets is crazy. It is such a difficult task, and women used to do it historically. And why should women be put into doing this again? Makes absolutely no sense. So we can't, go back and claim something good from the past. I mean, one also has to recognize the inequalities associated with those structures of the past, whether there were inequalities around caste or inequalities around gender, and, contend with that. Now, of course, part of the logic, which I really didn't get to in the talk today, was the logic of scale. So scale is something that is the underlying sort of, foundation on which industrial processing works. And scale leads to standardization. So without scale, you can't have an industrial process that is, financially viable. But to create scale, you need to have standardization. In the case of millets, the huge variety of millet grain sizes and the different varieties of millets also that exist make it necessary to create machines that are able to deal with variability of grain size, grain shape, and of course, very, very small grain sizes of millets. But what that means from a technology point of view is that you need to create small scale machinery that can be customized and adjustable. But if you want to actually create a food system that is built on industrial processing of large scale, then you can only have standardized machines. Customization creates so much. I mean, it's not economies of scale anymore. And so For that purpose, you then have to go back and standardize your raw material. So the millet itself needs to be standardized, which is what we did with rice and wheat. And so the counter logic perhaps is actually to step away from a certain model of large scale standardization and in terms of the production and processing of food, but at the same time not to ditch technology. So that's one thing, people often ask me, are you anti-technology? And the point is not pro or anti-technology. The point is, well, who gets to decide what kind of technologies do we really need or do we want to make? Who gets to build them? Who gets to repair and maintain them? Who gets to decide who will actually use them? And what kind of market center or, market structures or livelihood structures that we can, build around them? Those are the real relevant questions to ask. So can we, in fact, create technologies that reduce the drudgery, but at the same time maintain the nutrition? Why not? So that's sort of a brief answer to your question.
Thanks, Ulu.
Thank you. Ankit, you may go ahead with your question.
Yeah, sure. Hello, ma'am. I have a question. I mean, a little bit background with the question. So, in the area where you have, you have done your research in Sitapur. So, my district is nearby Sitapur. Hardoi and Unnao are adjacent to Sitapur. They are sharing the boundaries as well. So, in the area, basically, the farmers shifted from, the millet and the pulses to rice and wheat. So there are other factors like how market and the availability of you have mentioned the machinery. So people like in our area, as I discussed, I have experienced that people stop producing pulses like you mentioned moong, urad, chana, because उसको प्रोसेस करने का कोई भी मशीन अवेलेबल नहीं होता है एंड गेहूं और धान के लिए इमीडिएटली यू हार्वेस्टर। तो जैसे आपने उसे खेत से वो फसल आपकी पक गई, immediately you harvest it, you sell into the market. But in this particular crops, farmers के लिए वो harvest करना and process करना is very difficult. The one thing, another market में वो sell नहीं कर पा रहे हैं और ड्यू टू नेचुरल कैलामिटीज व्हाट आई ऑब्जर्व की जो उड़द मूंग की फसल है वो जायद में होती है और उस टाइम पे अगर बेमौसम बरसात होती है, ओले पड़ते हैं वो फरवरी और मार्च के महीने में, अप्रैल में, जिसकी वजह से फार्मर्स वो उसका कोई उनको बेनिफिट नहीं होता, उनको बहुत नुकसान होता है। तो दे कोटेड की अगर हमने गेहूं किया होता या फिर हमने कोई और फसल की होती तो हमारा ये नुकसान नहीं होता। सो दोज ऑल आर फैक्टर्स कमिंग टुगेदर टू मोटिवेट फार्मर्स। सो व्हाट यू थिंक स्टेट उस तरीके से सोचे क्या कि हम कैसे वो सारे फैक्टर्स को और मिनिमाइज करें ताकि फार्मर्स उन फसल को ज्यादा प्रायोरिटाइज करें जिसमें अभी डेफिशिएंसी हो रही है। So farmers thinks it is easy, it is more easy to sell in the market to get it immediate cash through selling in mandis, but in those particular crops they are not able to do that. So that is a primary motivation. So how you look at those perspective, is that significant or something you need to explore in terms of research or something we need to explore in that arena? Yeah.
Excellent question. Excellent. And I'm so glad, good to again see you, Ankit. Sitapur had so many dal mills where dals from around the region, including Hardoi and many of these other districts, Lakhimpur and elsewhere, would come to the dal mills of Sitapur. So your point is absolutely right. When the dal mills closed by the 1950s, 60s was the heyday of the dal mills, and then they eventually closed all of them. So you're absolutely right that there is no longer any local processing available. And the government marketing system and the support in terms of incentives, both for inputs. So when you're talking about, Bemausam Barish, or when you're saying that, a lot of issues are also related to, now pests and insect attacks, low productivity, again, is another trope. The government, if you look at the investment in research, across different crops, then 90% or more of the budget for research has gone into rice and wheat. And hardly anything has gone into doing research for any of the pulses or oil seeds. So, which is one of the reasons why many of these farmers are saying that, how do we deal with all of these issues that are going on? And what has happened in the meanwhile is farmers have shifted from growing mixed, so pulses, oil seeds, and cereals were grown in mixed cropping systems on the farm. farmers have shifted away and they are growing monocrops now, monocrops of pulses, monocrops of oilseeds. And the kinds of issues that are emerging in that process are even more complicated to deal with. Earlier when people were growing these things together, there was a different kind of logic that was in place. You didn't have these many pests. You didn't have so many other kinds of issues of weeds and the rest of it. There were actual agroecological logics that made those things work together, which all of it has sort of now disappeared. There's hardly any support in terms of research to support help farmers on that front. And there is no marketing or purchase. Now, what is the government purchasing? It's purchasing rice, wheat, sugarcane. It's not purchasing the rest of it. So you also have the vagaries of price fluctuation on the market, where 1 year dals may be quite high and the next year the price of dals has gone down. So you cannot have systematic supply chains that can give proper signals to farmers so that they cultivate this over the long run. We had a technology mission on oil seeds in the mid 1980s, 1985 to 1993, 4 or something. And in that 7-8 year period, India became self-sufficient in edible oils. We stopped entirely imports for 1 year. For 1993-94, we had 0 imports. And then the mission stopped and the support stopped and the imports skyrocketed once again. So it's not that we can't do it, but we've just chosen to do other kinds of things. And of course, there are other kinds of inertias that now exist with the entire, what we're seeing in Punjab. Punjab is certainly not suitable to be growing rice under any circumstances. But there is such a sort of inertia lock-in that institutions there have now built in with rice growing that it is almost impossible to dismantle it. Although that will be good not only for the groundwater of Punjab and for the soils of Punjab and for the health of the people in Punjab as well as in North India with all the stubble burning that is going on. In every respect, it's better, except for the kind of lock-ins that exist now, institutional lock-ins that exist with rice. And that's a story everywhere. So, one cannot blame farmers, and we keep saying, oh, farmers are choosing to grow all this. Well, farmers' choices are structured by various other things that have been going on that one really needs to pay attention to. Did I answer both your questions? Maybe I missed. I'm not sure.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, the last point was like, should we look at those area to study that whether the ecosystem in terms of government policies or the local area kind of an intervention. So what kind of research is required in that area? That was my last question.
I think one of the important research questions that is critical to, linking issues, like I mentioned earlier, of agriculture, food, and health. It's important to look at all of these three in conjunction with each other. As sociologists, we either looked at agriculture in the past or now we're looking at food. But how do we look at these relationalities across these different aspects? And a good way to do that is to begin to understand how, from the perspective of an agroecological region, what is it that is suitable to be grown there? So from an agrarian point of view, what would work, or what is it that farmers did grow in the past historically? How was that linked to food cultures in that particular region? What is it that people ate? How is it that people processed those items? What were the combinations that people did? What were the kind of recipes? What were the kind of cultural festivals? What were the kinds of ritual offerings? All of that in relationship with local agroecologies and agricultural production. And then linking that, in fact, to the implications on diet, on health of people. So what were the theories of nutrition that existed? And Professor Harish Narayan Das at JNU has, done some very interesting work on this regard. Where we are looking, and, my own presentation today has looked at nutrition from a very biomedical lens. I'm talking about calories and protein and carbohydrates and vitamins and minerals and the rest of it. But in our own country, there are many, many, many knowledge systems that look at health using very different etymologies, very different vocabularies, very different structural ways of thinking about nutrition and the body. So how can we also recover in terms of a sociology of health? How do we bring back many of those kinds of, internally sort of consistent systems of looking at the body, looking at food, and looking at the land? All of those relationally, I think that kind of research is required for the hundreds of agroecological regions that exist in our country. I mean, really, that's a very big, large research project if we can take it up.
Right.
Thank you
I
so
think
much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit. I think there's one last question in the chat box as we are almost nearing 9. Good evening, ma'am. It was a wonderful session. I wanted to ask if this entire discourse around food security and increasing the quantity of food produced in the nation can be effectively countered through local food sovereignty models suitable to the context. For example, the preservation practices of the indigenous communities of the northeastern region in place of the chemically induced procedures.
Right. Thank you for your question. And, I'll tweak the question a little bit because typically I am asked that, if you're talking about producing food locally and through local food sovereignty models, can we feed everybody in the country? That's sort of a quick turnaround question that emerges. And it's very interesting to see, again, this links back to both historical data as well as, more recent global data on the amount of food that we are producing. Through our industrial food processing system, we are producing 3 times the number of calories that are actually needed for everybody on this planet to eat a full hearty meal, throughout the day. And so we are producing way too much food than what is required. We're using way too many more resources to do the same. And the rationale or the logic behind it is the running of an industrial food system around it. You have to create all those raw materials that can be pushed into the industrial food system, and then you need to create all those consumers who will consume all the stuff that the industrial food system is producing. So your question, to come back to your question, can local food sovereignty models actually be used to feed everybody? And the answer is yes, absolutely we can. But we have to restructure the way we think of food, the way we think of food supply chains. So expecting that we will get broccoli in Delhi or phool gobi in Delhi in the middle of the summer, when it's coming from Bangalore or wherever else, those kinds of things will have to be stopped. Or whether we can get, the greens that you get in the winter, you don't grow, those kinds of greens in other times of the year. You grow things according to season, but you also have to change your diets to consume things according to season. We can't get 20, 30 years back, you couldn't get milk products in the summer months because, animals don't actually produce milk all throughout the year. There are seasons when there's more milk production, there are seasons of less milk production. But now with the coming of dried milk powder, you can convert it into liquid milk or into cheese or paneer or butter or whatever else and sell it all the time. And so one will also have to seriously reconsider what is it as consumers we see in terms of options in front of us. It's not only the farmers who may want to change. This has to be a movement that can be done by bringing together both consumers and farmers and challenging the logic of industrialization and large-scale standardized production. So certainly, I think it can be tried, but it will require a lot of collaboration between various kinds of groups, and consumers, I think, have a very important role to play in the process.
And there's one more question. It's from Itimai. Good evening, ma'am. In Orissa, farmers are encouraged to cultivate millets in an organic way. For that, they are given training in providing seeds, but most of the farmers say that seeds reach them very late, and the quality is also bad. So, if they're not able to sell them, then organic practice is anyway a complex process. So, selling to the mandi is the last hope, and developing market for that, especially in the rural area, is a difficult task. Could you please say something about these issues?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. So the Odisha Millet Mission is the one that has been doing a lot of outreach in terms of getting farmers, of course, as you said, training and inputs, and also buying back the millets that are grown. The Karnataka government has also been buying millets, and that has also been incentivizing farmers to grow millets. But it's sort of a bit of a challenge here that, with farmers having shifted to monoculture production, what one is possibly seeing is also monoculture millet production. And that is quite problematic, where, we are used to, in some ways, a certain monoculture logic that you grow one thing on the farm and you get very high productivity, and then, you get a lot more quantity, and of course, you sell it. That logic doesn't really work with the economic logic of the price. Every year farmers produce a lot. Whenever there's high productivity, the prices fall and farmers ultimately don't get much. But in the years of low productivity, the farmers who have got something, prices are very high, so then they may get some money out of it. So the economic logic around productivity doesn't quite work. But at the same time, Millets have historically always been grown in mixed cropping patterns. They have not been grown as monocultures. And what we really need to get away from is the monoculture logic of growing foods. We need to be able to incentivize and support and help farmers shift away from monocultures and to growing multiple things together on the farm at the same time, and create the marketing systems that facilitate that. I mean, if a farmer is growing 10 different things on the farm, then the farmer will not have a lot of quantity of one thing to go and sell once at the end of the season to the market. A farmer may need to sell something every week or maybe every 4 days. Can we create marketing systems and can we create support systems that can facilitate this kind of an engagement with the market, and at very, very small scale with diverse forms of quality, instead of a standardized product that has to be homogenized when it comes to the mandi? Can we create marketing systems that can take into account the need for diversity, the need for multiple qualities, the need for smaller scale, the need for a more localized transportation networks, the need for more localized consumption of these products? So this requires a reimagination at multiple levels. It's not enough to say, oh, let's give MSP for all products, or let mandis buy all products. One has to be far more imaginative than that.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. Okay. Thank you, Richa, for the talk and for the Q&A. I think most of the questions, or rather all the questions, were very engaging and made us all think. So I would say that the purpose of holding this talk was successful. The recording would be uploaded on the YouTube channel of ISS, and you can later access it if you want to, go back to some of the things that Dr. Kumar has mentioned. So thank you once again for this enriching talk, and feel free to check out the Food Cultures website that our speaker has mentioned. And if you have queries, you can definitely reach out to her on her email. I'm assuming that's the case.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a real pleasure speaking today, and thank you so much for inviting me, Rituparna. It's really been a wonderful time. Thank you. And the questions were excellent.
Yeah, most of them are research scholars working in different, universities on food. So I think they're the new generation of hope. So that's
Right.
also exciting.
Please feel free to write to me on my IIT email. I can put it here in the chat if people, or you can also look me up and you will get my
Yes.
email online. Thank you. Thank you.